The grade of the service road hit 18% near the switchback, a steep, punishing incline that demanded torque over speed. My truck, a 10-year-old 3/4-ton diesel, was not built for comfort. It was built to pull dead weight up bad hills. I kept the transmission locked in second gear, listening to the turbocharger spool, a high-pitched whine that cut through the low rumble of the engine block. The tires, studded specifically for the northern Idaho winter, bit into the hard-packed snow with a tactile grinding sensation that vibrated up through the steering column and into my palms. I was not driving fast. Speed is a liability when the shoulder of the road drops 2,000 feet into a black ravine filled with Douglas fir and granite scree. I was driving with the deliberate, heavy momentum of someone who knows that stopping is not an option. The dashboard clock read 11:42 p.m. The temperature gauge outside claimed it was 9 degrees below zero, but up here, in the wind tunnel of the Bitterroot Range, ambient temperature was just a number. Wind chill was the only metric that mattered. My phone sat in the cup holder, face down. I did not need to look at it to know it was dead. The signal had failed 3 miles back, right around the time the gravel turned to ice. The last notification I'd seen was a frantic mass broadcast alert from the Emergency Management Division. It had not been a weather warning. It had been a shelter-in-place order, phrased with the kind of vague, panic-inducing language that bureaucrats use when they have lost control of the narrative. Civil unrest, biohazard containment, avoid urban centers. I was not avoiding an urban center. I was fleeing a collapsing one. The headlights swept across a rusted yellow sign. Authorized personnel only. Federal trespassing statutes apply. I shifted down to first. The engine note deepened, a guttural growl of compression braking. The tires crunched over a hidden cattle guard, the suspension absorbing the shock with a stiff jolt. Ahead, the trees thinned, revealing the silhouette of the objective against the starless sky. Station Echo 9. It was not a cabin. It was not a retreat. It was a microwave relay station, a relic of the Cold War telecommunications grid that had been partially modernized in the early 2000s and then largely forgotten by everyone except the technicians who kept the red lights blinking. A single, windowless block of reinforced concrete squatting next to a 200-foot lattice steel tower. I stopped the truck 20 feet from the perimeter fence. The silence that followed the engine shut down was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of nature. It was the oppressive, heavy silence of a vacuum. No birds, no traffic. Just the relentless, hollow roar of the wind shearing through the steel lattice of the tower above. It sounded like a giant intake valve, sucking the air out of the world. I did not step out immediately. I sat in the cab, the residual heat of the heater vent fading against my knuckles. I ran a mental inventory, a habit drilled into me during my apprenticeship. Fuel, 3/4 of a tank plus 2 jerry cans in the bed. Water, 20 gallons in rigid polyethylene containers. Food, 6 weeks of dry goods, if I rationed to 1,200 calories a day. Tools, everything. I took a breath, the cold air inside the cab already nipping at my nose, and opened the door. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a wall of moving air that instantly searched for the gaps in my collar and cuffs. I slammed the truck door, the sound deadened instantly by the gale. I moved to the bed of the truck and grabbed my bolt cutters. There were 36-inch heavy-duty cutters, the handles wrapped in friction tape. The gate was a 12-foot chain-link slider topped with razor wire. The padlock securing it was a high-shackle boron alloy model, the kind designed to frustrate amateurs. I was not an amateur, but I also did not have the key. This site belonged to a different telecom provider than the one I contracted for, but physics does not care about jurisdiction. I did not bother with the cutters on the lock itself. The shackle was too thick and the steel too hardened. Instead, I went for the chain-link fabric attached to the tension bar. I positioned the jaws of the cutters over the galvanized wire mesh. I squeezed. The handles offered resistance, then the wire yielded with a sharp, distinct snap that vibrated through my forearms. I repeated the motion. Snap, 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 cutting a vertical slit in the fence fabric just wide enough to reach my arm through and access the latch mechanism from the inside. I did not need to cut the lock. I just needed to bypass the gate motor's clutch. I reached through the hole, my heavy glove fumbling against the cold steel of the drive chain housing, and found the manual release lever. It was frozen stiff. I pulled a small butane torch from my parka pocket, ignited it, and held the blue flame against the housing. The metal sweated as the frost turned to steam. After 30 seconds, I tried the lever again. It groaned, a sound of dry metal on dry metal, and disengaged. I shoved the gate. It rolled on its track with a rhythmic, grinding protest, the rusted bearings fighting every inch of movement. I opened it just wide enough for the truck, then ran back to the cab. I did not want the engine block to cool down yet. Once inside the perimeter, I parked the truck facing out. That was the first rule of site work. Always park so you can leave in a hurry. I backed it up until the tailgate was 3 feet from the heavy steel door of the shelter. This created a windbreak and minimized the distance I'd have to haul gear. I killed the engine for the final time. The silence returned, heavier now. I stepped out and approached the bunker door. It was a standard industrial security door, painted a drab, oxidization-resistant gray. No handle, just a keypad and a key cylinder. I did not have the code, and I did not have the key. But I knew these doors. They were solid core steel, set in concrete frames. Battering it down was impossible. But hinges are hinges. I retrieved a cordless angle grinder from the truck's toolbox, slapping in a fresh 6-point amp-hour battery. The diamond-tipped cutting wheel looked small against the mass of the door, but I was not cutting the door. I was going after the exposed hinge pins. It was a design flaw in these older sites. The hinges faced outward to allow the door to swing fully open for equipment loading. I pressed the trigger. The grinder whined to life, the torque twisting my wrist. I touched the wheel to the top hinge pin. A shower of bright orange sparks erupted, illuminating the concrete wall in a strobe-like spray. The sound was a high-frequency scream, the kind that penetrates hearing protection and rattles your fillings. I worked methodically, grinding the head off the pin until it was flush with the knuckle. It took 20 minutes to grind the heads off all 3 hinges. My hands were numb despite the gloves, the vibration of the tool leaving a phantom buzzing sensation in my fingers. I set the grinder down and picked up a drift punch and a 4-pound hammer. I placed the punch against the bottom of the hinge pin and struck it. The impact was dull, a solid thwack that absorbed into the heavy door. The pin did not move. I hit it again, harder. A millimeter of movement. I fell into a rhythm, strike, reset, strike, until the pin popped out the top, falling into the snow with a soft hiss. When the last pin fell, the door did not just swing open. It slumped. The weight of the steel caused it to lean precariously against the frame, held only by the friction of the latch side. I jammed a pry bar into the gap and levered it outward. The door groaned, a deep, resonant complaint of twisting metal, and swung free, exposing the interior. The smell hit me first. It did not smell like a home. It smelled like ozone, stale dust, and the sharp, chemical tang of warm electronics. It was the smell of a machine that had been running alone for decades. I clicked on my headlamp and stepped across the threshold. The interior was a single large room, dominated by racks of server equipment and transmission gear. LED indicators blinked in the dark, steady greens, flashing ambers, and a few ominous reds. The hum here was palpable, a low-frequency vibration that you felt in your teeth rather than heard. Cooling fans whirred in a chaotic harmony, struggling to push air through dust-clogged filters. To the left was the DC power plant, a wall of rectifiers converting grid AC into the clean 48-volt DC that the telecom gear demanded. To the right, the battery backup strings, massive, sealed lead-acid blocks arranged on reinforced steel shelves. They were the heart of this place. If the grid died, those batteries were the only thing standing between me and the freezing dark. I checked the ambient temperature inside. 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but 50 degrees warmer than the outside air. The heat was waste energy, a byproduct of the amplifiers and rectifiers doing their work. I walked to the rear of the room, where a small technician's desk sat pushed against the wall. A logbook lay open, the last entry dated 6 months ago. Routine PM, filter change, sight clear. I set my rifle case on the desk. It was not a weapon for fighting a war. It was a tool for perimeter defense, same as the bolt cutters were for entry. But right now, my priority was not defense. It was thermodynamics. The concrete walls were uninsulated. In the summer, they acted as a heat sink to keep the equipment cool. In the winter, they were thermal bridges, sucking heat out of the room and radiating it into the mountain air. The equipment generated heat, yes, but if the grid failed and the equipment shut down, this room would turn into a refrigerator within 4 hours. I needed to consolidate. I went back to the truck. The wind outside had picked up, driving snow horizontally across the compound. I grabbed the first load, the Pelican cases containing my personal tools, a sleeping bag rated for -20 degrees, and the rigid water jugs. Hauling the gear inside was a lesson in friction and gravity. The floor of the shelter was raised anti-static tile, slick and hard. I slid the heavy cases across the floor, the plastic runners squealing against the vinyl. I built a wall of gear near the warmest part of the room, the exhaust vent of the main rectifier rack. Once the truck was empty of the essentials, I turned my attention to the door. I could not rehang it properly. The hinge pins were destroyed. I had to secure it. I pushed the heavy steel slab back into the frame. It fit poorly now, listing to one side. I used 2 heavy ratchet straps, hooking one end to the interior door handle and the other to the steel uprights of the nearest equipment rack. I cranked the ratchet handles, clack, 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 until the straps were taut, singing with tension, pulling the door tight against the seals. It was not perfect. A draft hissed through the gap at the top, a thin knife of cold air. But it would hold. I sat on one of the plastic cases and pulled off my gloves. My hands were red, the knuckles swollen from the cold and the impact of the hammer. I rubbed them together, trying to force blood back into the capillaries. I looked at the battery bank. 4 strings of North Star 170 amp-hour batteries. If they were healthy, they held enough energy to run the lights and a small heater for a week, provided I killed the load from the transmission equipment. If they were sulfated and old, they might last a night. I stood up and grabbed my multimeter. I needed to know the truth. I walked down the row of batteries, probing the terminals. 13.5 volts, 13.5 volts, 13.4 volts. Float charge was good. They were taking power from the grid. But voltage does not tell you capacity. Only a load test does that, and I was not ready to kill the main breaker yet. I moved to the main AC distribution panel. It was a square D breaker box, gray and utilitarian. I opened the panel door. The main breaker was a big 200-amp switch. Below it, rows of smaller breakers fed the various circuits. Lighting, HVAC, rectifiers, convenience outlets. I needed to see what was happening outside. Not the weather, the world. There was a ladder on the side of the tower, protected by a safety cage. I was not going up there in this wind. But the station had a microwave dish pointing back toward the valley, toward the city of Spokane, 100 miles west. Beside the rack of radio gear, there was a small maintenance monitor, a CRT screen burned in with the ghosts of old menus. It was connected to a pan-tilt zoom camera mounted on the tower, used for inspecting the ice shields. I hit the power button. The screen hummed, a rising pitch of charging capacitors, and flickered to life in monochrome green. I manipulated the joystick on the console. The servos on the camera outside were frozen sluggish. The image on the screen smeared and jerked as the camera fought the ice and the wind. I panned it around, aiming it away from the antennas and down toward the horizon. The view was grainy, distorted by the snow flying past the lens, but the optics were high-grade industrial glass. I zoomed in. The valley floor was a sea of black, punctured by islands of chaotic light. The city was not just dark, it was fractured. The grid had clearly failed in sections. Large swaths of the suburban sprawl were totally blacked out. But in the downtown corridors, fires were burning. Not the steady, amber glow of streetlights, but the flickering, organic pulses of uncontrolled combustion. I saw a cluster of bright white lights, emergency floodlights, near what I knew was the hospital district. Then, as I watched, that cluster blinked out. 1 second it was there, the next, it was gone, swallowed by the void. I watched for 10 minutes. I saw headlights on the interstate, but they were not moving in the steady streams of a commute. They were gridlocked, stationary ribbons of white and red. Occasionally, a single vehicle would break away, driving across the median or into the ditch, desperate to escape the trap. The infection, the riots, the panic, whatever name you wanted to give it. It looked different from up here. It looked like a circuit board shorting out. Sparks, heat, and then dead silence. I turned the monitor off. The green glow faded to a pinprick and vanished. I was alone. The realization settled in my gut, heavy and cold like a stone. I turned away from the equipment and looked at my makeshift camp. A sleeping bag on the floor, a stack of water jugs, a rifle. This was not a camping trip. This was an indefinite hold. The immediate problem was the air. The shelter was designed for machines, not biology. The ventilation system brought in outside air to cool the equipment. Right now, it was pumping sub-zero air into the room to cool rectifiers that were barely breaking a sweat. I walked over to the intake vent, a louver set into the wall near the floor. I could feel the draft, a steady stream of freezing air pooling around my boots. I grabbed a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a sheet of thick plastic vapor barrier I'd scavenged from a construction site weeks ago. I cut the plastic to size with my pocket knife, the blade parting the thick polyethylene with a quiet zip. I taped it over the intake vent, sealing the edges. The tape struggled to stick to the cold concrete, so I used the heat gun from my toolkit to warm the adhesive as I applied it. It was a slow process. Heat, press, smooth, repeat. When I finished, the draft stopped. The room instantly felt stiller, stagnant. That was a problem for later, CO2 buildup and condensation. For tonight, retaining heat was the priority. I checked the thermometer again. 46 degrees. It had risen 1 degree just from my body heat and the sealing of the vent. My stomach growled, a hollow reminder that I had not eaten since leaving the apartment. I dug into one of the food bins and pulled out a foil packet of tuna and a handful of crackers. I ate standing up, leaning against the warm metal of the server rack. The food was tasteless, just fuel to keep the metabolic furnace burning. After eating, I set up my sleeping area. I laid down a closed-cell foam pad, then an inflatable camping mattress on top of that. Insulation from the floor was critical. Concrete draws heat out of a body faster than air does. I unrolled the sleeping bag, lofting the down fill. I stripped off my parka and heavy boots, placing them neatly by the door. I kept my thermal base layers on. I checked the rifle, chamber empty, magazine full, and placed it within arm's reach. I crawled into the bag, zipping it up to my chin. The floor was hard, and the hum of the servers was loud, a constant white noise that drowned out the wind outside. I lay there, staring up at the cable trays suspended from the ceiling. Bundles of black coaxial cable and yellow fiber optic lines ran like arteries above me, carrying data that no longer mattered to destinations that probably did not exist anymore. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. My mind was racing, running diagnostics on my own survival. Water. I had 20 gallons. At half a gallon a day, that was 40 days. I could melt snow, but that required fuel. Heat. The grid was still up, for now. When it died, the generator would kick in. The generator had a 500-gallon belly tank. At a half-load burn rate of 2 gallons an hour, that was 10 days, maybe 12. After that, solar. The panels on the roof were for auxiliary loads, not heating. I needed a plan for when the diesel ran out. A sudden sound made my eyes snap open. A heavy, metallic clunk from the other side of the room. I froze, holding my breath. My hand moved slowly out of the sleeping bag, fingers closing around the cold polymer of the rifle stock. I listened. The wind howled outside. The fans whirred. Then it happened again. Clunk. It was not the door. It was coming from the ventilation ductwork overhead. I relaxed my grip on the rifle, letting out a long exhale. It was the thermal expansion dampers slamming shut against the wind pressure. Just the building adjusting to the storm. Just metal reacting to cold. Just physics, I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded flat and small in the acoustic dead space of the concrete box. I rolled over, turning my back to the blinking lights of the server racks. I was the anchor now. The world down below was drifting away, breaking apart in the current, but I was bolted to the mountain. I closed my eyes and focused on the vibration of the floor, the hum of the grid that was still, miraculously, holding on. I woke up to the sensation of falling, a sudden, lurching drop in the pit of my stomach. It was not gravity. It was the silence. The hum of the HVAC unit had died. The low-frequency vibration of the rectifiers had vanished. The station was dead quiet, save for the wind scouring the exterior concrete like sandpaper. Then, the darkness broke. Not with light, but with sound. A violent mechanical spasm shook the floorboards beneath my sleeping bag. It felt as if a giant hammer had struck the foundation of the building. This was the automatic transfer switch, the ATS, slamming its contacts from utility to emergency. The solenoid throw was strong enough to vibrate the fillings in my teeth. 3 seconds of absolute stillness followed. The delay timer. Then the generator woke up. It did not start like a car. It started like an earthquake. The $60,000 diesel engine, located in the adjacent room, turned over with a grinding, metallic struggle against the cold oil in its sump. It caught on the third revolution. The sound was an overwhelming rhythmic percussion that punched through the cinder block wall. It was a physical pressure wave, a bass note so deep it resonated in my chest cavity. The lights in the main room flickered, once, twice, and then flared to steady brilliance. The rectifiers groaned as they took the load, converting the dirty AC power from the generator into clean DC for the batteries. The grid was gone. We were officially an island. I sat up, my breath pluming in the air. The temperature inside had dropped to 38 degrees while I slept. I checked my watch. 4:15. The grid had held for 4 hours after I arrived. Now, the clock was ticking on the fuel reserves. I rolled out of the sleeping bag, the cold tile stinging my feet through my wool socks. My first move was not to panic. It was to check the telemetry. I walked to the ATS panel on the wall. The digital display glowed angry red. Source 1, failed. Source 2, available. Load, on genset. I grabbed my hearing protection, a pair of heavy-duty earmuffs hanging from a hook by the door, and slipped them on. The world muffled into a dull thrum. I picked up a flashlight and opened the internal fire door leading to the generator room. The noise tripled instantly. Even with the muffs, the sound of the engine was a roar that blurred vision. The room was small, dominated by the massive yellow engine block and the alternator.
The air here was turbulent, whipped into a frenzy by the cooling fan on the front of the engine, which was blasting air through the radiator and out a louvered vent in the wall. I walked around the beast, checking for leaks. A cold start puts immense stress on gaskets. I ran my gloved hand under the oil filter housing. Dry. I checked the fuel lines. Dry. The engine was running rough, hunting for a steady RPM as it warmed up, but it was running. But there was a problem. A massive problem. The radiator fan was pushing thousands of cubic feet of air per minute out of the building. To replace that air, the intake louvers on the opposite wall were wide open, sucking in outside air at sub-zero temperatures. The generator room was effectively a wind tunnel. If I opened the door to the main equipment room for heat, I would not get warmth. I would get a blast of Arctic air that would freeze the batteries in an hour. The generator was creating massive amounts of heat, enough to heat a house, but the design of the station was ruthlessly efficient at rejecting that heat to the atmosphere. It was wasting the one resource I needed most. I backed out of the room and let the heavy fire door slam shut. The noise dropped back to a tolerable vibration. I needed to harvest that heat. I needed to perform surgery on a running heart. I went to the tool crib, a metal cage in the corner of the main room. It was stocked with the basics: wrenches, screwdrivers, a multimeter. But I needed plumbing supplies. I scanned the shelves. Nothing but spare air filters and a box of Cat 5 cable. I turned my attention to the ceiling. Running along the cable tray was a disused hydronic heating loop. Decades ago, before the electronic equipment generated enough waste heat to warm the building on its own, this station had used a hot water system. The boiler was long gone, ripped out during the last upgrade, but the copper pipes remained, painted over and forgotten. And mounted in the corner, near the ceiling, was a unit heater, a radiator box with a fan behind it. If I could tap into the generator's coolant loop, the hot antifreeze leaving the engine block before it hit the big radiator, and divert it through that unit heater, I could turn the generator into a central heating plant. It was a simple concept. Executing it with scavenged parts while the engine was running was a different story. I spent the next hour scavenging. I stripped lengths of heavy rubber hose from a defunct dehumidifier unit. I raided the truck for hose clamps and a hacksaw. I found a bucket of miscellaneous brass fittings in the bottom of a server rack, left behind by some contractor years ago. The plan was risky. The coolant in the generator was under pressure and scalding hot, about 180 degrees Fahrenheit. If I blew a hose, the engine would overheat and seize within minutes.
If I seized the engine, the power died. If the power died, the batteries froze. If the batteries froze, I died. I decided to shut the generator down for the tie-in. It was a gamble. The batteries were fully charged, but the cold would seep in fast. I walked back to the ATS and flipped the switch to test off. The silence that rushed back into the room when the engine died was disorienting. My ears rang with a high-pitched phantom whine. I moved fast. I did not run. Running leads to mistakes, but I moved with aggressive purpose. Back in the generator room, the heat was already fading. I located the coolant supply line coming off the engine block. It was a 2-inch diameter reinforced rubber hose. I placed a drain pan under the engine and opened the petcock on the radiator. A stream of bright green ethylene glycol pissed into the pan. The smell was distinct, sickly sweet and chemical, like hot syrup. I watched the level, waiting until the upper hose was empty. While it drained, I went to work on the unit heater in the main room. I climbed a ladder, balancing on the rungs with a hacksaw. I cut the old copper supply lines. The metal was soft, the blade biting through it with a gritty friction. Saw, 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 snap. I pulled the heater off the wall brackets. It was heavy, a 50-pound box of copper coils and steel fins. I lowered it to the floor, my shoulders burning from the strain. I dragged the heater into the generator room and mounted it on a makeshift stand made of cinder blocks, positioning it away from the intake draft. Now came the splice. I took the hacksaw to the generator's main radiator hose. Cutting a perfectly good hose on a critical piece of infrastructure felt like a violation of every protocol I knew. The rubber was tough, reinforced with nylon braiding. I had to saw at it, the rubber dust coating my gloves. When the blade finally cut through, a splash of residual green coolant vomited onto the concrete. I inserted a brass T-fitting I'd fabricated from the scavenged parts. It was a crude assembly, a 1-inch nipple jammed into a reducer, but it fit. I wrestled the hose ends onto the brass barbs. The rubber was stiff from the cold and age. I had to use a heat gun to soften the ends, kneading the material until it was pliable enough to slip over the metal. I cranked the hose clamps down until the stainless steel bands bit deep into the rubber. I ran 2 lines of the scavenged dehumidifier hose from the T-fitting to my relocated unit heater. It was a closed loop. Hot coolant would leave the engine, flow through my heater, dump its heat into the room, and then return to the engine to be cooled by the main radiator. I closed the drain petcock and poured the salvaged coolant back into the reservoir. I had lost maybe a pint to the floor. I topped it off with water from my jerry cans. It would dilute the antifreeze protection slightly, but not enough to matter. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the fine motor exhaustion of wrestling cold rubber and twisting screwdrivers with frozen fingers. A blister on my thumb had torn open, the raw skin stinging against the dirty wool of my glove. Time to test. I went back to the ATS and flipped the switch to auto. The engine cranked. Chug, chug, chug. It did not catch. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the control panel. Overcrank fault. I cleared the alarm and tried again. The starter motor whined, a high-torque scream of electricity fighting friction. The engine turned over slowly. The oil was getting cold. I had taken too long. "Come on," I hissed through my teeth. Chug, chug, boom. A plume of black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack outside, and the engine roared to life. The vibration returned, settling into that familiar bone-shaking rhythm. I rushed to the splice. I watched the hose clamps with the intensity of a bomb disposal technician. As the engine warmed up, the pressure in the system built. The hoses swelled slightly. A single bead of green liquid appeared at the edge of the supply line. I grabbed my nut driver and cranked the clamp another half turn. The metal squeaked in protest. The leak stopped. I waited. The temperature gauge on the engine climbed. 100 degrees, 140 degrees, 180 degrees. The thermostat opened. Hot coolant rushed into my jury-rigged loop. The copper coils of the unit heater began to radiate warmth. I knelt in front of it, pulling off my gloves. The air coming off the coils was not just warm, it was hot, aggressive, industrial heat. I let out a laugh, a short, sharp bark that was lost in the noise of the engine. I had just stolen 20,000 BTUs of waste energy. I left the generator room door propped open just 2 inches, enough to let the heat from my new radiator spill into the main room, but not enough to let the intake draft suck the air out. Back in the main room, the temperature began to climb. 40 degrees, 45. By noon, it was 55. It was not tropical, but compared to the sub-zero void outside, it felt like luxury. But heat was only one leg of the tripod. Water was the next. I had 20 gallons. That was finite. The snow outside was infinite, but melting it required energy. Now, I had energy. I set up a production line. I took a heavy plastic storage tote and cleaned it with alcohol wipes. I went outside, braving the wind. The storm was still raging, a whiteout that reduced visibility to 5 feet. I shoveled snow into the tote, packing it down until it was a solid block of ice crystals. I dragged the tote into the generator room and placed it directly in front of my new heater. The blast of hot air hit the plastic. Within minutes, the bottom of the tote was slick with water. The problem with snow water is that it's dead. It has no minerals, and it tastes flat. Worse, surface snow can contain fallout from the air, soot, pollution, or whatever biological agent was tearing the cities apart. I needed filtration. I built a gravity filter using a stack of 5-gallon buckets. In the top bucket, I drilled small holes in the bottom and lined it with a layer of shop rags, followed by a layer of crushed charcoal I made by smashing burnt wood from a dead fire pit I found near the perimeter fence. It was not activated carbon, but it would strip the bad tastes and some volatile chemicals. I poured the meltwater into the top. It dripped through the rags and charcoal, falling into the bottom bucket with a slow, rhythmic plip, plip, plip. It was slow, painfully slow, but it was sustainable. By evening, the routine had set in. Check the generator oil. Check the coolant hoses for leaks. Shovel snow. Pour water. Check the batteries. I was sitting at the technician's desk, dissecting a meal ready to eat, MRE, Menu 18, beef ravioli, when the radio crackled. It was not a two-way radio. It was the site's emergency band receiver, a piece of rack-mounted gear designed to pick up EAS alerts. I had left the volume low, a constant static hiss in the background. The static broke. A voice cut through, distorted by distance and interference. Sector 4, negative containment, repeat, failure at the bridge. I spun the chair around and turned up the gain. The voice was male, breathless, clipped. It did not sound like a broadcast. It sounded like a transmission from a handheld unit, bouncing off a repeater somewhere in the chain. Blockade is compromised. They are pushing north on Highway 95. If you are listening, avoid the corridor. Visual confirmation of changes. They are not stopping for tear gas. Over. Highway 95. That was the main artery running north-south through the valley, 10 miles to the east of my position. I looked at the topographic map pinned to the wall. Station Echo 9 sat on a spur ridge overlooking that highway. I was high above it, invisible from the road. But if the corridor was compromised, the flood of refugees and whatever was chasing them would be moving through the terrain. I walked to the rifle case. I took the bolt action out and laid it on the bench. I had a box of .308 ammunition, 20 rounds. I was not a soldier. I was a technician. My job was to keep the lights on and the data flowing. But looking at the rifle, I realized my job description had just expanded. I needed to secure the perimeter. The chain link fence was cut. The gate was jumped. I was exposed. I grabbed the spool of baling wire I'd found in the shed and a pair of pliers. I put my parka back on. The warmth of the room felt like a betrayal as I zipped the jacket up. I did not want to go back out there.
The wind sounded like it was stripping the paint off the building. But comfort is the first step toward complacency, and complacency gets you killed. I stepped out into the night. The darkness was absolute, swallowed by the storm. I clipped my safety line to the handrail near the door, a habit from tower climbing. The wind tried to knock me down instantly. I leaned into it, trudging toward the gate. I spent an hour wiring the gate shut. I wove the steel wire through the chain links, twisting it tight with the pliers until the metal screamed. It was not a lock. It was a tangle. If someone wanted to get in, they would have to cut it, and cutting takes time. Cutting makes noise. As I finished the last twist, I saw it. Down in the valley, through a break in the driving snow, a line of lights was moving on the highway. Not headlights. Fires. A string of burning vehicles, stationary and blazing, marking the road like a runway of destruction. And moving between the fires, tiny pinpricks of light, flashlights, maybe headlights, swarming north. The voice on the radio was right. The dam had broken. I turned back to the bunker. The heavy steel door looked small against the mountain. Inside, the generator chugged on, a mechanical heartbeat keeping the cold at bay. I was not just an anchor anymore. I was a lighthouse. And in a storm this dark, a lighthouse does not just warn ships away. It draws them in. I went inside and locked the door behind me. I did not just engage the latch, I re-rigged the ratchet straps, cranking them down until the door frame groaned. I sat in the warmth of the generator's stolen heat, listening to the drip of the water filter and the hum of the rectifiers. The systems were holding. Water, heat, power. I had engineered a bubble of survival. But as I watched the red LEDs on the server rack blink in the dark, I knew the hardest part was not building the systems. It was defending them. The first warning was not an alarm. It was a frequency. I was sitting at the technician's desk, rebuilding a solenoid valve from a spare parts kit, when the floor began to hum. It was not the rhythmic throb of the diesel generator in the next room, nor was it the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans. This was a new vibration, a low, discordant shudder that traveled up through the concrete foundation and into the steel legs of the chair. It felt like the building itself was shivering. I stopped working, my hand hovering over the disassembled valve. I pressed my palm flat against the desktop. The vibration was irregular, surging and fading in sync with the gusts of wind outside. I looked at the server rack. The mounting rails were trembling. A loose cage nut rattled in its slot, a tiny metallic oscillation that set my teeth on edge. Then the alarm triggered. It was not a siren.
It was the waveguide pressure monitor, a small, analog gauge on the RF distribution panel. A red light flashed silently next to the needle, which had dropped from 5 psi to 0. The waveguide is the jugular vein of a relay station. It's a hollow, rectangular copper pipe that carries the microwave signal from the transmitters inside the shelter up to the dishes on the tower. Because moisture kills microwave signals, the pipe is pressurized with dehydrated air. 0 psi meant a breach. The system was open to the atmosphere. I grabbed the maintenance handset and punched in the diagnostic code for the transmitter. The screen flashed a warning. High VSWR. Reflected power limit served. The transmitter had shut down to protect itself. The signal was dead. But the signal loss was a symptom. The vibration was the cause. I stood up and walked to the wall that faced the tower. I pressed my ear against the cold concrete. Through the 18 inches of reinforced aggregate, I could hear it. A chaotic, violent hammering. Something massive was striking the side of the tower, transmitting the shockwave down the steel legs and into the shelter's foundation. I knew exactly what it was. Ice loading. The storm had shifted from dry snow to freezing rain and back to snow. That creates a laminate, layers of ice that build up on the steel lattice. If the ice gets thick enough, it changes the aerodynamic profile of the tower members. The wind does not just flow around them anymore. It catches them, creating lift and drag in an alternating cycle. Aeroelastic flutter. Galloping. And somewhere up there, 80 feet or 100 feet off the ground, a piece of hardware, an ice shield, a bracket, maybe even a dish alignment arm, had sheared its bolts under the stress and was now flailing in the 60-mile-per-hour wind, bashing against the structure. If it hit the main waveguide bridge, it would crush the copper. If it hit a structural crossmember hard enough and often enough, it could fatigue the steel until the leg buckled. If the leg buckled, the 200-foot tower would come down. And because of the wind direction, it would not fall away from the shelter. It would fall directly through the roof. I did not have a choice. I moved to the gear locker. This was not a perimeter check. This was a climb. I stripped off my outer layer and put on a full-body climbing harness. It was a Petzl industrial rig, heavy webbing with quick-connect buckles that felt cold and stiff against my hips. I tightened the leg loops until they dug into my thighs. Circulation was a luxury. Security was mandatory. I grabbed my positioning lanyard, a 6-foot rope with a mechanical adjuster, and clipped it to the side D-ring. Then came the twin leg fall arrest lanyard, the Y lanyard with the massive rebar hooks. I checked the shock absorber pack. Intact. Helmet. Headlamp with fresh lithium batteries. Balaclava. Goggles. I stood in the center of the room and visualized the tool loadout. I could not bring a toolbox up there. Everything had to be tethered. If I dropped a wrench from 80 feet, it was gone forever. I took a heavy canvas ditty bag and clipped it to my harness. Into it went a 3-pound drilling hammer, a large pry bar tethered with paracord, a pouch of heavy-duty stainless steel zip ties, the kind used for HVAC ducting, rated for 200 pounds of tensile strength, a ratchet strap, 2 inches wide, 20-foot length, a roll of self-fusing silicone tape for the waveguide. I pulled on my climbing gloves, insulated, but with leather palms for grip. They reduced dexterity by 30%, but bare hands would be frostbitten in 3 minutes. I walked to the door. I paused. The vibration in the floor was getting worse. The impacts were coming faster, a rhythmic battering that sounded like a giant kicking the building. I unlocked the deadbolt. I cranked the ratchet straps loose. The door jumped in the frame, pushed by the pressure differential.
I took a breath, holding the freezing air in my lungs to brace myself, and kicked the door open. The world outside was a white void. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. It was a physical force, a turbulent river of air that tried to knock me backward into the equipment racks.
The snow was horizontal, stinging my exposed cheeks like sandblast grit. I clipped my safety line to the exterior handrail and fought the door shut, leaning my entire body weight against the steel to engage the latch. I locked it. I turned toward the tower. The beam of my headlamp cut a cone through the driving snow, illuminating the base of the structure. The steel legs were coated in 3 inches of rime ice, jagged, white formations growing into the wind. I approached the ladder face. The safety climb cable, a steel wire running the height of the tower, was encased in a sheath of ice. My cable grab device, the mechanical slider that connects my harness to the wire, was useless. I could not attach it. I would have to climb 100% hooked. Move a lanyard hook, clip to a rung, climb 2 steps, move the other hook. It is the slowest, most exhausting way to climb a tower. I grabbed the first rung. It was thick with ice. I smashed it with the side of my gloved fist, shattering the crust until I felt the galvanized steel underneath. I gripped it. The cold bit through the leather instantly. I began the ascent. Step, clip. Step, unclip. Reach. Smash. Clip. At 20 feet, the shelter roof was below me. The wind speed increased as I cleared the windbreak of the building. The tower was swaying. Not much, maybe 2 or 3 inches, but at height, that movement feels like being on the mast of a storm-tossed ship. At 40 feet, my breathing was a ragged gasp. The air was too cold, too thin. My goggles were starting to frost over on the edges. I stopped to rest, wrapping my arms around the tower leg, burying my face and my elbow to warm the air before I inhaled it. That's when I heard the impact clearly. Crack! Wham! It was above me. Close. I looked up. Through the swirling snow, I saw a dark shape thrashing against the gray steel. It was the ice shield for the 6-foot dish at the 80-foot level. The shield was a conical fiberglass and steel cap designed to keep snow off the antenna face. One of its 3 mounting struts had snapped. The wind was catching under the cone, lifting it up, and then slamming it back down against the waveguide bridge. Every time it hit, it crushed the copper pipe a little more. And every time it lifted, the remaining 2 struts twisted, metal fatigue working to snap them. If the shield broke free entirely, it would fall. Directly below it lay the generator exhaust stack. If 100 pounds of steel crushed that stack, the generator would suffocate, stall, and die. I had to get to 80 feet. I resumed the climb, finding a rhythm born of desperation. Smash the ice, clip the hook, pull, step. My forearms burned with lactic acid. The wind tried to peel me off the ladder, gusting in unpredictable eddies that shoved me sideways. At 60 feet, the vibration was violent. The tower was ringing like a struck bell. At 75 feet, I was level with the dish. I clipped both lanyard hooks to a structural crossmember, ensuring I was redundant. I leaned back into my harness, letting the webbing take my weight so I could use both hands. The ice shield was a wild animal. It was 6 feet in diameter, catching the wind like a sail. It slammed against the tower leg, wham, sending a shockwave through my boots. I needed to pin it down. I unclipped the heavy ratchet strap from my bag. The wind whipped the loose end of the strap away instantly, the heavy metal hook flailing in the air. I had to time my move. I waited for a lull.
The wind dropped for a heartbeat. I lunged, grabbing the loose strut of the shield. It bucked in my hand, possessing a terrifying amount of kinetic energy. I hauled on it, screaming with the effort, trying to pull it flush against the dish face. It would not move. The hinge was frozen. I grabbed the drilling hammer. I swung it in a short, brutal arc, striking the frozen hinge mechanism. The impact was a dull thud that jarred my wrist. Ice shattered. I hit it again. The hinge freed. The shield swung partially back into place. I looped the ratchet strap around the body of the dish and over the broken shield strut. I connected the hooks. I began to crank the ratchet. Click, click, click. The sound was lost in the wind, but I felt the tension building.
The strap tightened, compressing the shield against the antenna. I cranked it until the webbing was as hard as iron. The banging stopped. The tower was still swaying, still groaning under the wind load, but the violent, rhythmic hammering was gone. I was not done. The waveguide. I looked at the copper run. The outer jacket was shredded, and the copper was dented, flattened to half its diameter. A hairline crack was visible near the flange, hissing faintly as the last of the pressurized air escaped. I pulled the roll of self-fusing silicone tape from my pocket. It was cold and stiff. I shoved it inside my mouth, gagging on the taste of rubber, holding it there for 30 seconds to warm it up. I peeled the backing off. I wrapped the crack, stretching the tape to activate the chemical bond. I wrapped it tight, layer over layer over layer, creating a thick, rubberized cast over the fracture. It would not hold pressure perfectly, but it would keep the melting ice and water out of the system. I slumped back in my harness, hanging 80 feet in the air, gasping for breath. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of hypothermia. My hands were claws, locked into the shape of the tools I'd been holding. I checked my work. The shield was immobile. The waveguide was wrapped. The tower stood. I prepared to descend. I looked down to check my path. The beam of my headlamp washed over the compound below. It illuminated the roof of the shelter, the snow-covered truck, the fence line. And then it caught something else. Beyond the perimeter fence, where the access road curved around the ridge, a light appeared. It was not a fire. It was not the erratic sweeping of a looter's flashlight. It was a pair of headlights. Twin beams, yellow and focused, cutting through the blizzard. They were moving slowly, crawling up the switchbacks in low gear. I froze. My light was on. I was a beacon in the sky, a bright star hanging 80 feet above the mountain. I reached up and killed my headlamp. Darkness slammed into me. The vertigo was instantaneous. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the icy steel, waiting for my inner ear to recalibrate. I opened my eyes. The headlights below kept coming. They were a mile out, maybe less. A vehicle capable of making that climb in this weather, that meant four-wheel drive, chains, and a driver who knew how to handle deep snow. It was not a refugee. Refugees do not drive up dead-end service roads in a blizzard. Refugees head for the valleys, for the highways. This was something else. I watched the lights disappear behind a stand of timber, then reappear closer. They were heading for the gate. I had to get down, fast. The descent was a controlled fall. I abandoned the two-hook protocol. I clipped one hook, slid down the ice-covered rail, caught a rung, unclipped, reclipped. It was reckless. A slip meant a 20-foot fall before the shock absorber deployed, which would likely break my ribs or slam me into the steel hard enough to knock me unconscious. But I moved with the urgency of prey. I hit the ground, my legs buckling under the impact. I did not fall. I stumbled toward the door, fumbling for my keys with numb, useless fingers. I got the key in the lock. I turned it. I shoved the door open and fell inside. The warmth of the shelter hit me like a physical wall, humid, smelling of diesel and ozone. I slammed the door and locked it. I re-engaged the ratchet straps, cranking them down until the frame groaned. I did not take off my gear. I did not check my frostbite. I went straight to the camera monitor. I powered it up. The CRT whined. The image was dark, useless without the infrared illuminator which was broken. I went to the equipment rack. I killed the main lights in the room, plunging the shelter into darkness, illuminated only by the blinking LEDs of the servers. I moved to the technician's desk and picked up the rifle. I cycled the bolt, chambering around. The action felt stiff in the cold room. I checked the safety. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against the steel. The wind was still howling, but underneath it, I heard a new sound. A sound I knew intimately. The low, throaty idle of a large diesel engine. It was just outside the gate. I heard the crunch of a heavy parking brake engaging, then the heavy thud of a truck door closing. Someone was here. I backed away from the door, moving into the shadows behind the battery rack. I raised the rifle, resting the barrel on a shelf of lead-acid cells. I aimed at the door. The handle jiggled. It was a polite test, a check to see if it was unlocked. Then a pause. Then a heavy, rhythmic pounding. A fist in a glove striking the metal. Thump, thump, thump. A voice, muffled by the wind and the steel, shouted something. I could not make out the words, but the tone was not aggressive. It was desperate. I did not answer. I kept my finger outside the trigger guard, my breathing shallow and controlled. The pounding stopped. I heard the scrape of metal on metal, someone trying to pry the latch. No, it sounded like a key. I stared at the lock cylinder. It did not turn. Of course not. I had changed the cylinder myself 3 months ago, a non-standard protocol I'd adopted because too many contractors had the master key. Silence returned. Then, the sound of footsteps crunching away from the door. I did not relax. I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The engine outside revved up. The sound receded, fading into the howl of the storm. They were leaving? Or were they repositioning? I stood there in the dark, shivering violently now as the adrenaline crash overlapped with the hypothermia. The tower above was silent. My repair held. The crisis of the machine was over. But the crisis of the mountain had just begun. I walked to the logbook on the desk. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold the pen. I wrote a single line under the date, 02:45 a.m. Visitor attempted entry. Possessed key. Denied. I put the pen down. I looked at the radio. The silence in the room felt different now. It was not empty. It was waiting. The adrenaline crash did not feel like a relief. It felt like a fever. I sat on the floor with my back against the battery rack, the rifle across my lap, shivering violently. It was the kind of shivering that starts in the marrow and shakes the skeletal frame. A biological override trying to generate friction in a body that had lost too much heat. My hands were the worst. I had pulled the gloves off to inspect the damage. The tips of my fingers were waxy and white, the nail beds tinged a sickly gray. Frost nip. Not gangrene, not yet, but the nerves were screaming as the blood forced its way back into the constricted capillaries.
The sensation was like holding my hands in a bucket of boiling water while someone hammered nails into the joints. I grit my teeth, breathing in short, sharp hisses through my nose, forcing myself not to rub them. Rubbing damages the crystallized tissue. You have to let it thaw. You have to endure the return of feeling. The shelter was quiet. The generator hummed in the next room, a steady, rhythmic companion.
The wind outside had dropped to a low, moaning draft that pulled at the corner of the door seal. I stared at the heavy steel door. The ratchet straps were tight. The deadbolt was thrown. But the image of the keyhole would not leave my mind. Possessed key. That was not a looter. Looters carry crowbars and battery-powered angle grinders. Looters try to smash the lock. They do not try to finesse it. A key meant a technician, a site manager, or a federal asset. Someone who knew that Station Echo 9 was here, and who expected to walk right in. Why did they leave? They left because I did not answer, because the gate was wired shut, because the silence of the station suggested it was dead. And in this new world, you do not waste calories investigating a tomb. Or maybe they saw the truck. Maybe they assumed the occupant was armed and entrenched. They were right. The pain in my hands subsided to a dull, throbbing ache. I stood up, my knees popping. I needed to know what they had left behind. But not tonight. Tonight, the objective was thermal recovery. I heated a can of chili on the canister stove, eating it straight from the tin. The spice burned my cracked lips. I drank a liter of warm water. Then I crawled into the sleeping bag, keeping the rifle inside with me. The cold steel barrel pressed against my hip, a reminder that the perimeter was no longer just a fence. It was a radius of intent. Time dissolved. The calendar on the wall remained on November 14. I stopped marking days. The Gregorian calendar is a tool for coordination, for meetings and billing cycles. Alone on a mountain, time is measured in tank levels and amp hours. The routine became the religion. 7 hours. Wake up. Check the temperature. The improvised heater loop off the generator was holding the room at 55 degrees, comfortable enough to work in a fleece layer, cold enough to see your breath if you exhaled sharply. 7:30 hours. The walk around. I checked the ratchets on the door. I checked the voltage on the battery plant. I checked the fuel gauge on the generator belly tank. 8 hours. Water production. I hauled snow. I melted snow. I filtered water. The charcoal filter was slowing down, clogged with particulates. I had to backflush it every 3 days now, wasting precious clean water to clear the blockage. 12 hours. The silence. I would sit at the desk and listen to the radio scan. The dial spun through the frequencies, HF, VHF, UHF. Static. The white noise of the universe. Occasionally, a burst of encrypted digital traffic would chirp through, a sound like a robotic saw cutting metal. It was military or government, high-level comms hopping frequencies faster than my scanner could track. Someone was still organizing, still commanding. But they were not talking to me. 16 hours. Maintenance. This was the sanity block. A machine that sits idle rots. A machine that runs constantly wears. By the 3rd week, the generator began to complain. The oil pressure was fluctuating. The gauge needle twitched between 40 and 45 psi. It was not a critical failure, but it was a symptom. The oil was getting dirty, saturated with soot and unburnt diesel. I did not have 50 gallons of fresh 15W40 oil. I had 5.
I had to build a bypass filter. I spent 3 days fabricating it. I took a roll of toilet paper, dense, single-ply industrial tissue, and shoved it into a canister made from a piece of 4-inch PVC pipe I'd cut from the old drain lines. I drilled tap points into the oil pressure sender port on the engine block. I ran a 1/4-inch line through my toilet paper filter and back into the oil fill cap. It was a France filter design, an old trucker's trick. The dense paper would trap particles down to 1 micron, polishing the oil while the engine ran. It would not replace the additives, but it would remove the abrasive soot that was chewing up the main bearings. When I installed it, I held my breath. I fired the engine. Oil flowed into the PVC canister. The paper swelled. Pressure held. The oil on the dipstick, which had been turning black, began to clear up over the next 48 hours, returning to a dark honey color. I patted the yellow flank of the engine block. "Good girl," I whispered. I caught myself doing that more often.
Talking to the machines. The generator was the old man. The battery bank was the ladies. High maintenance, needed constant attention. The tower was the spire. It was not madness. It was personification. Humans are social animals. When the people leave, we recruit the furniture. The fuel anxiety set in during the 5th week. The belly tank held 500 gallons. I was burning roughly 12 gallons a day to keep the heat loop effective and the batteries floated. That gave me 40 days. I was halfway through. I had to reduce the burn. I changed the logic on the automatic transfer switch. Instead of running continuous, I set the generator to cycle. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. The off cycles were brutal. When the engine died, the silence rushed back into the room like a flood. The heat from the radiator loop dissipated within 30 minutes. The temperature in the shelter would plummet. 50 degrees, 40, 30. I spent those 4 hours inside my sleeping bag, wearing everything I owned. I read technical manuals by the light of a single LED headlamp on its lowest setting. I memorized the torque specifications for a Caterpillar C15 engine. I learned the chemical equations for lead sulfate crystallization. It was during one of these dark cycles that I heard the wolves. They were not close. They were down in the valley, their howls carrying on the wind. It was a lonely, haunting sound, a chorus of hunger.
They were moving up. The game, the deer and elk, were moving down to escape the deep snow. But the predators were moving up. Why? Because the valley was dangerous. The wolves knew what I knew. The cities were not empty. They were full of something worse than hunger. Week 7 brought the thaw. It was not spring. It was a Chinook, a warm, dry wind that spilled over the Rockies and raised the temperature by 40 degrees in 12 hours. The snow did not melt. It sublimated. The hard pack ice turned to slush, then to mud. The silence of the wind was replaced by the sound of dripping. Water ran off the roof. The tower shed its ice load in massive, terrifying sheets that crashed into the compound like artillery shells. I took the opportunity to inspect the gate. I walked out to the perimeter. The air felt unnervingly warm, heavy with moisture and the smell of wet pine needles. The snow around the gate had receded, revealing the gravel and the mud. I found the tracks. They were frozen into the mud, preserved where the truck had packed them down before the freeze. A dual rear-wheel pickup, heavy tread, all-terrain tires, and boot prints. I crouched next to them. They were Vibram soles, tactical boots, not hunting boots. Organized. The prints walked up to the gate, stood there, and then walked back. But there was something else. Stuck into the chain-link fence, right at eye level, was a zip tie.
A bright yellow zip tie, cinched around the wire mesh. It was not mine. I had not seen it in the blizzard. The visitor had left a marker. I pulled my knife and cut the tie loose. I held it in my palm. It was standard electrical grade, but on the tail, someone had written in black permanent marker, CHK 4. 11/22. November 22nd, the night of the storm. CHK probably meant check. I was not a survivor to them. I was a waypoint on a list. Station Echo 9 had been audited. The realization made my stomach turn. They knew the generator was running. They knew the site was secure. They had not tried to breach because they did not need the shelter yet. They were cataloging assets. When the time came, when their primary location failed or they needed the repeater tower active for their own comms, they would come back. And they would bring the key again. Or a torch. I went back to the truck. I checked the odometer. I had half a tank of diesel in the truck, plus the 2 jerry cans in the bed which were still full. If I had to run, I could make it maybe 400 miles. But where? The radio report suggested the corridors were kill zones. The mountains were death traps of snow. My best chance was to stay. To be the tick that digs in so deep it cannot be removed. I returned to the shelter and went to the door. The ratchet straps were not enough. I spent the rest of the warm spell fortifying. I drilled holes into the concrete floor behind the door. I installed heavy-duty drop-in anchors. I cut lengths of uni-strut channel, heavy steel railing used for mounting equipment, and built a diagonal brace. Now, even if they unlocked the latch, they could not open the door. They would have to cut the door in half to get in. It turned the shelter into a vault. It also turned it into a coffin. If there was a fire, I was not getting out fast. The cold returned with a vengeance 3 days later. The mud froze into jagged ruts. The wind shifted back to the north, stripping the warmth away. The routine resumed, but the flavor had changed. It was not just maintenance anymore. It was preparation. I started rationing food harder. I cut the MREs in half. Breakfast was hot water and a vitamin tab. Dinner was half a packet of rice and beans. My belt felt loose. I punched a new hole in the leather with an awl. I looked at myself in the small mirror in the bathroom. My face was gaunt, the beard thick and unkempt. My eyes sunk deep into their sockets. I looked like the hermits I used to joke about. The isolation was doing strange things to my processing speed. I would find myself staring at a bolt for 10 minutes, admiring the geometry of the threads, forgetting why I had picked up the wrench. I had to verbalize my actions to stay on track. Loosen the nut, clean the terminal, apply the grease, tighten the nut. My voice sounded raspy, unused. Then, the battery string failed. It happened during the sleep cycle. I woke up to the smell of sulfur, rotten eggs. I scrambled out of the bag, clicking my headlamp on. The smell was overpowering. I rushed to the battery rack. String number 2 was hot. Physically hot. I could feel the heat radiating off it from 3 feet away. One of the cells had developed an internal short. It was boiling the electrolyte, venting hydrogen sulfide gas into the room. Hydrogen gas is explosive. I did not think. I reacted. I grabbed the breaker panel and slammed the disconnect for string 2. The arc flash inside the breaker box snapped like a pistol shot. I ran to the door. I had to vent the room. I undid the ratchet straps. I kicked the brace away. I shoved the door open. The cold air rushed in, mixing with the sulfur stink.
I coughed, my lungs burning. I grabbed the fan I used for the heat loop and turned it around, pointing it at the door to push the gas out. I stood in the doorway, shivering, watching the invisible cloud dissipate. I had lost 25% of my battery capacity in 10 seconds. I walked back to the rack. The bad battery was swelling, the plastic case bulging outward. It was dead weight now. I spent the next 6 hours performing surgery. I had to bypass the bad cell. I used jumper cables made from scraps of 4-0 welding cable.
I had to unbolt the heavy lead terminals, careful not to short my wrench against the frame and weld it to the metal. It was dangerous, delicate work. My hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. One slip and I could dump 1,000 amps of current through my heart. When I finished, I re-engaged the breaker. The string held. The voltage stabilized. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor. I was exhausted. I was starving. The smell of sulfur still lingered in the fabric of my clothes. I looked at the logbook. Day 62. String 2, cell 4, failure. Bypassed. Capacity reduced to 75%. I looked at the fuel gauge. 30%. The math was closing in. The walls were closing in. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind. The silence was not empty anymore. It was heavy. It pressed against the eardrums. I reached for the radio. I did not scan this time. I tuned it to a specific frequency, 146, 520 megahertz, the national calling frequency for ham radio. I picked up the microphone. I had not transmitted once since I arrived. Transmitting makes you a target. I held the PTT button. The plastic clicked. "This is Station Echo 9, I said. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. "This is Station Echo 9, monitoring. Is anyone out there?" I let go of the button. Static, hiss, pop. I waited 1 minute. 2. "This is Station Echo 9. I have capacity. I am secure." Silence. Then a break in the static. A voice. Not the polished government voice. A voice like mine. Tired. Wary. "Echo 9. This is Vector 7-1. I hear you. What is your location?" I froze. Vector 7-1. That was not a ham call sign. That sounded tactical. I looked at the yellow zip tie on the desk. CHK4. I looked at the microphone. If I gave my location, I was inviting the world in. The wolves, the people with the keys, the desperate refugees. But if I did not, I was just a ghost in a concrete box, waiting for the fuel to run out. The voice came back. "Echo 9, we are looking for technical assets. We have a convoy moving on the Ridge Road. Do you have heat?" They were close. They were on the Ridge Road. That was my road. They were not asking for coordinates. They were asking for permission. I looked around the room. The blinking lights, the humming generator, the heat, the water. I had built a fortress, a machine that turned death into life. But a machine needs an operator, and an operator needs a purpose. I keyed the mic. "Vector 7-1, this is Echo 9. I have heat. I have power." I paused. I looked at the door, fortified with steel struts. I looked at the rifle. "Approach the gate with lights off," I said. "Driver only exits, hands visible. I am armed." "Copy that, Echo 9. Lights off. 1 PAX. ETA 10 mics." I put the microphone down. I stood up. I went to the water bucket and splashed my face. I ran a comb through my beard. I put on my heaviest parka. I checked the rifle. Chamber loaded. Safety on. I walked to the door. I dismantled the bracing. I undid the ratchets. I opened the door to the night. The storm had broken. The sky was clear, a vast, terrifying dome of stars hanging over the black peaks. The Milky Way was a river of diamond dust, brighter than I had ever seen it. Down the road, I saw it, a shadow darker than the trees, moving. The crunch of tires on snow. I stepped out onto the threshold. I was not running away. I was not hiding. I was the anchor, and the ship was coming in. I raised the rifle to the low ready, took a breath of the razor-sharp air, and waited for the first pair of eyes to reflect the starlight.